Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
I very much want common sense immigration reform to pass. This bill is going to pass the Senate. But as written, this bill will not pass the House. As written, this bill will not pass into law. And if this bill did become law, it would not solve the problem. Indeed, it would make the problem of illegal immigration that we have today worse rather than better. If you likewise want to see common sense immigration reform pass, then you have reason to be both optimistic and pessimistic. You have reason for optimism because there is widespread bipartisan agreement on many, many aspects of immigration. Outside of Washington, D.C., there is widespread bipartisan agreement that, number one, our current immigration system is broken. It is not working. Number two, that we have to get serious about securing the borders, about doing everything we can to stop illegal immigration, that in a post-9/11 world, it doesn't make any sense that we don't know who's coming into this country, we don't know their history, we don't know their background. And number three, that we need to improve and streamline legal immigration, that we need to remain a nation that doesn't just welcome, but that celebrates legal immigration. On those basic principles, there is widespread bipartisan agreement. And if this body were to focus on those areas of bipartisan agreement, that's how we would get an immigration bill passed into law, not just by one chamber of Congress, but actually passed into law. The reason, Mr. President, however, for pessimism is that to date, the conduct of the White House and the Senate Democrats who have been driving this process suggests that they are more interested in finding a partisan issue to campaign on in 2014 and 2016 than they are in actually passing a bill to fix our broken immigration system. Of all of the issues swirling about this bill, the path to citizenship for those who are here illegally is the single most divisive issue. And that is the issue on which the Obama White House and the Senate Democrats insist. And by insisting on that division, I believe they, by design, destine this bill to be voted down. I think if we don't end up fixing our immigration system, that would be a very unfortunate outcome. Now, I would note in the Judiciary Committee, we spent considerable time considering amendments to this bill. And at the outset of the markup, I observed that I hoped it would be a real markup, that the majority had the votes if they wanted to reject every substantive amendment. But I very much hoped that they wouldn't, that they would be willing to work with the members of the committee to improve the bill to make it fix the problem. Sadly, at the end of the markup, I was forced to observe that it had played out exactly as I feared it might at the beginning. Namely, that the majority of Democrats on the committee voted down just about every single major substantive amendment that was presented, one after the other after the other. And what they repeatedly said was there had been a deal that was cut. A deal that was cut with the union bosses, with the interest groups, and that deal could not be changed. Well, if that's the case, Mr. President, that deal is not going to get passed into law. In my view, this legislation has two major problems. The first is it does not fix the problem. You know, in 1986, Congress passed major immigration reform, the last time we addressed and successfully passed immigration reform. And that bill had two major components. Number one, it granted amnesty, explicit, full-out amnesty for some 3 million people who were then here illegally. And the American people were told this amnesty will be in exchange for securing the borders. In 1986, Congress told the American people, we're granting amnesty, but in exchange, we will fix the problem so illegal immigration will go away as a problem. Once these 3 million get amnesty, there will be no more. Now, sadly, we're here some 30 years later, and instead of 3 million, there are roughly 11 million people here illegally. Because what happened in 96 is the amnesty happened, and the borders never got secured. If this bill were to pass into law, in 10, 20, 30 years, we'd be back here talking about another 10, 20, 30 million people here illegally because, like the 1986 bill, this bill will not fix the problem, and indeed it will exacerbate it. This bill is enormously complicated. Indeed, this bill, as currently written, is 1,076 pages. 1,076 pages. It is longer than the Dodd-Frank bill, which was 848 pages. It is roughly half the size of Obamacare, which was over 2,000 pages. In these 1,076 pages, there are right now over 1,000 waivers given to the Secretary of Homeland Security and other members of the executive branch to waive law enforcement provisions, to waive border security, to give to the executive more standardless, unreviewable discretion. And that, unfortunately, would only serve to exacerbate the problem. Illegal immigration is an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem in my home state of Texas, where I've spent real time down on the border visiting with ranchers, with farmers, with people living on the border who every week have people coming illegally across their property who no longer lock their doors at home because they've discovered if they lock their doors, they just get broken into. And so it's simpler not to lock the door rather than deal with the damage of the locks being broken or the doors kicked in. If you look at the numbers, in fiscal year 2012, the Border Patrol reported 463 deaths, 549 assaults, and 1,312 rescues. And let me point out, this current system is the opposite of humane. This current system ends up having vulnerable people coming here seeking freedom, entrusting themselves to coyotes, to drug cartels, to traffickers, and being left sometimes, women and children, to die in the desert, being left sometimes subject to sexual assault, to exploitation, to trafficking. The U.S. Department of State estimates that 14,000 to 17,000 people are trafficked into the United States every single year. And when it comes to the drug cartels and their role in facilitating illegal immigration, the volume is staggering. Between 2006 and 2013, there were 9.28 million pounds of marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin seized in Texas alone. To put that in perspective, the space shuttle weighs about 4.5 million pounds, which means there were twice as much, 2 space shuttles worth of illegal drugs seized, trafficked across the border. But you know, the second major failing of this bill, it's not likely to pass. There are not 218 votes in the House of Representatives to pass a pathway to citizenship. My friends on the Democratic side of the aisle know that, but I think they've made a political judgment that they want to campaign on this issue rather than rolling up their sleeves and saying, how do we actually get a bill that can pass into law? That's what I hope this body does. Now, in the course of the markup, I worked very hard to try to improve this bill because I want to see a bill that fixes the problem pass into law. And specifically, I introduced 5 amendments to fix the bill, to fix the problem. Those amendments were all voted down with every Democrat on the committee voting against them. And on the floor of the Senate, I hope to introduce the same amendments. And if they're voted down again and this body passes that bill, I very much hope the House of Representatives will look to these amendments as providing a pathway to fixing this bill, to actually addressing the problem. The first bill I introduced was an amendment to actually secure the borders. The amendment I introduced, unlike the current bill, which requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to prepare a plan, and the trigger is when the Secretary prepares a plan, that triggers the legalization provisions of this bill. Well, a plan to plan is by design toothless. Instead, the amendment I introduced would have tripled the size of the U.S. Border Patrol to put manpower on the ground, boots on the ground, to solve the problem. It would have increased fourfold the helicopters and fixed-wing assets and technology on the ground to solve the problem. It would have put in place a biometric exit-entry system because 40% of the illegal immigration we have comes from visa overstays. Unfortunately, every single Democrat on the committee voted against that amendment. Mr. President, I introduced two amendments to improve and substantially increase legal immigration. And on this point, let me pause for a second to note, there is no more enthusiastic advocate of legal immigration in the United States Senate than I am. I am the son of an immigrant. I am the son of one who had been imprisoned and tortured in Cuba, who came to this country with nothing, seeking freedom, and we need to welcome and celebrate legal immigrants. So I introduced two amendments focusing on improving legal immigration so that we can continue to welcome those from all around the world coming here seeking freedom. First, I introduced an amendment concerning temporary high-skilled worker, H-1B visas. Now, H-1B visas, high-skilled workers, are overwhelmingly pro-growth. The economic data indicates that for every 100 H-1B high-skilled workers who come into this country, 183 jobs are created for U.S. citizens. The amendment I introduced would take the current cap of H-1B visas, which is at 65,000, and increase it five-fold to 325,000. The current bill, the Gang of Eight bill, goes up to 110,000. That's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. There's far more demand than that. You know, right now, every year, we educate tens of thousands of foreign students in our universities. They get graduate degrees in mathematics and engineering and computer science. They get PhDs, and then we send them back to their countries, where they start businesses there, they create businesses there, they create jobs there, and they compete against us. It makes absolutely no sense. I think we need to expand dramatically high-skilled workers, and my amendment would increase it fivefold. Every single Democrat on the committee voted against it. Now, I would note, Mr. President, that the proponents of this bill often find themselves in Silicon Valley, telling our friends in the high-tech industry how they are champions for helping get more programmers, engineers, computer scientists into this country. And yet I'd note again, every single Democrat on the Judiciary Committee voted against increasing H-1B high-skilled workers. We need to increase that cap. The second amendment that I introduced that would increase legal immigration would double the overall cap on legal immigration from 675,000, the current statutory cap, to 1.35 million, so that we can have a legal system that has employment-based immigration. When people have jobs, they can meet areas of need, whether in agriculture or elsewhere, and they can also come for family unification. I'm sorry to say that many of my friends on the left side of the aisle, who often describe themselves as advocates of the Hispanic community, advocates of immigrants, every Democrat on the Judiciary Committee voted in party line against increasing legal immigration and against doubling the caps of legal immigration. Finally, I introduced two other amendments that were both directed to respecting and maintaining the rule of law. One amendment simply eliminated the pathway to citizenship, and what it provided is that those who are here illegally shall not be eligible for citizenship. Now, it's important to note, Mr. President, that under the existing bill, if my amendment had been adopted, those who are here illegally would be eligible for what's called RPI status, a legal status, and indeed in time would be eligible for legal permanent residency. So the underlying bill gives legal status to the 11 million people who are here illegally. The amendment I introduced simply said there needs to be a consequence for having violated the law. It is unfair, in my opinion, to the millions of legal immigrants who followed the rules, who stayed in line, who stayed in their home country years or decades, to reward those who broke the law with a path to citizenship. It is also, I believe, critical to passing this bill to remove the path to citizenship, and yet every single Democrat on the committee voted party line against this amendment. The final amendment I introduced was an amendment that provided that those who are here illegally shall not be eligible for state, local, or federal means-tested welfare payments. Now, this is an interesting issue because the advocates of the Gang of Eight bill frequently go on television and tell the American people none of those granted amnesty in their bill will be given welfare. I've seen that. That is a central talking point. Mr. President, if that talking point were true, this should have been a very easy amendment to adopt. But yet every single Democrat on the committee voted against this amendment. And one of the reasons is, although the Gang of Eight bill for a period exempts those here illegally from federal welfare, roughly $300 billion a year is spent in state welfare. And those who would give an amnesty under this bill would be eligible for a great portion of that state welfare, immediately means-tested welfare. In my view, we should welcome people from across the world, but the people we should be welcoming are those who are coming here to seek the American dream, to work hard. I believe that's the vast majority of immigrants who are coming here for a better life. And we should not be putting into place systems where the hardworking American taxpayers are being taxed to provide welfare for those who are here illegally. I think that respects the rule of law to say, we will welcome you here if you are working to provide for your family. You know, each of these amendments were rejected, and often my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle would say something like, I may agree with this particular amendment, but there was a deal cut. I may agree, but the union bosses, the special interests, the people in the closed-door rooms who negotiated this deal, we agreed on a level and we can't increase it. It may be good to increase high-skilled workers up to 325,000, but we cut a deal with the union bosses and we can't change it. Mr. President, that's not how legislation should be drafted. We should be fixing the problem. We should be making our economy stronger. Right now, in my opinion, this bill is headed to failure. There should be no drama. There should be no confusion. Now, let's be clear. This bill, I am convinced, is going to pass the U.S. Senate. In fact, I think it's going to pass the U.S. Senate with a substantial margin. In all likelihood, near the end of this process, there will be an amendment or two directed at border security that the American people will be told, okay, this finally puts teeth into the border security provisions. I hope those representations prove true. But regardless of what happens on that, I believe the votes are already pre-cooked that this bill is going to pass the U.S. Senate. But absent major revisions, absent revisions along the lines of the amendments that I introduced in committee and intend to introduce on the floor again, this bill will crash and burn in the House. And it is designed to do so. So how do we save it? If we actually want to fix the problem, not have a political game, but fix the problem, the answer, Mr. President, is the American people. The American people have to speak up. If you want to see the border secured, pick up the phone and let your elected representatives know. Let senators know. Let members of the House know. Speak out online. Speak out publicly. When the American people speak out and speak out loudly, their voices are heard. If you want legal immigration improved so that we welcome high-skilled workers, we welcome those seeking the American dream, speak out. If you want to respect the rule of law and not grant amnesty without securing the borders, speak out and speak out loud. And let me say, what needs to happen to change this dynamic is the key stakeholders need to decide that failure is not an option. The high-tech community, the business community, farmers and agricultural leaders need to decide that they are not willing to have this entire bill held hostage to a provision providing a pathway to citizenship that is certain to fail and designed to fail. And I want to speak finally to the Hispanic advocacy groups, to the many who passionately pour their hearts into trying to improve the conditions of those in this country, including the 11 million who are here illegally. I believe the current path this bill is on is a path that is, by design, going to yield it being voted down. I think that is why the Obama White House is insisting on a pathway to citizenship. I would note, in 2007, then Senator Obama stood on this floor of this Senate and played a key role in killing immigration reform then for the same reasons, for partisan reasons. And indeed, I would suggest the moment of clarity came in the Judiciary Committee markup when a senior Democrat, who is one of the sponsors of this bill, said, if there is no path to citizenship, there can be no reform. I think that sentence summed it all up. And I certainly thank that senior Democrat for his candor, because he made clear that there was one overwhelming partisan objective, which is a path to citizenship. And in his judgment, if that partisan objective could not be accomplished 100%, he was willing to do nothing, zero, to improve the border. He was willing to do nothing, zero, to improve legal immigration, nothing, zero, to expand high-tech immigration, nothing, zero, to improve farmers and agricultural workers, and most tellingly, nothing, zero, to improve the condition of the 11 million people currently here illegally. Because, based on the Obama White House's position that with no path to citizenship, we will take our marbles and go home, we will crater this entire bill. That outcome means those 11 million remain in the shadows, have no legal status, whereas if the proponents of this bill actually demonstrate a commitment not to politics, not to campaigning all the time, but to actually fixing this problem, to finding a middle ground, that would fix the problem and also allow for those 11 million people who are here illegally a legal status with citizenship off the table. I believe that's the compromise that can pass, but at least right now, the partisan advocates of this bill are not willing to accept that. The only thing that can change that is if the American people speak up. The only thing that can change that is if the stakeholders make clear to the Obama White House, to the Senate Democrats, failure is not an option. That if this fails because, as a political matter, you insisted on a path to citizenship and threw everything else overboard, that failure would be unacceptable. I very much hope we work together in a bipartisan manner to fix this problem in a way that secures the border, in a way that respects rule of law, and in a way that improves legal immigration so we remain a nation that welcomes and celebrates legal immigrants. Thank you, and I yield the floor.